In 2010, director Martin Scorsese and star Leonardo DiCaprio gave the world a tense and horrifying thriller about the erosion of the human mind.
In 2020, we try a rye from one of the premier brands in whiskey.
The film is Shutter Island.
The whiskey is Willett Family Estate bottled 4-year rye.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at Martin Scorsese's 2010 effort, Shutter Island.
I just have one more question for you, Mrs. Kearns. Did you ever meet a patient named Andrew Latis?
No. Never heard of it.
Brad, we're kicking off a small mini-series here of movies that are celebrating their 10th anniversary. And so we're going to be visiting Shutter Island this week, The Social Network next week, and then the week after that, Christopher Nolan's Inception. So we are coming up on 2 out of 3 films featuring Leonardo DiCaprio. And Brad, as I look over our schedule from the last few seasons, we have really gone all in on the Leonardo DiCaprio movies. Pretty soon, I don't think we'll have any more films of his to talk about.
Who was that, Bob? I don't recognize the name.
He's a small character actor. You probably wouldn't notice him if you really weren't looking out for him in these movies that we've been watching. But
is he the guy who always has a dead wife?
Yes, he is.
He's so good at playing that character.
He's so good at having a dead wife.
No, but honestly, Bob, as I think about Leo's career, you know, I'm glad that we watched Revenant a little bit earlier on. But the important thing is to realize that, like, how did he not win an Oscar before Revenant?
I know, man. And listen, I know Leonardo DiCaprio has his detractors, or not even detractors, but I think that there are some people who think that he's a little bit more limited than we sometimes give him credit for, because he does kind of play the same character again and again. And I think the point where, if you are like in that camp, the 2 movies that you could point to really prove your point would be this and Inception. Because I know, Brad, I know you've seen Inception before. We're going to come up on it in a couple of weeks here. But he really does play essentially the same character in this movie and in Inception. And they came out just months apart from each other.
Yeah. I mean, as I was watching this film, it gives you mad Inception vibes. The characters that he plays are so similar. I think that this one has a little bit more nuance to it in the way he loses his mind. And the message at the end is a little bit more intriguing. But that probably comes from the fact that Scorsese's a better filmmaker than Nolan. So when you get down to it, when you look at Leo's entire career, I don't know, Bob, I think I might actually put myself in the camp of saying that Leo is a little more one-sided than the people who love him might say.
Yeah.
Because even when you look at, like, The Aviator, he just has this kind of manicness to him in all of his movies that he rarely strays from. You know, I haven't seen Wolf of Wall Street, but I would imagine that it's there as well. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, and you know, I don't mean to get us off topic immediately here, Brad. There's a lot of people that think Wolf of Wall Street might be his best performance because it is just slightly out of that groove that he's been in, which is like these mentally, psychologically tortured individuals. Whereas the Wolf of Wall Street he's kind of just playing a douche, and like, but again, he's in
it's a great new lane for him to drive in.
That's right, but it's in the same sort of wheelhouse. So yeah, Brad, I am excited to get into talking about Shutter Island, which I truly do think is one of Leo's best performances, if not one where he really like breaks the mold of what we're used to seeing.
And I think to really dive into it, we need to go to America, nay, the world's favorite segment.
Yeah, Brad, and it's appropriate that you start calling it the world's favorite segment. You know, here at the Film and Whiskey Podcast, we do not limit ourselves to just American listenership. And so real quick, Brad, I was looking at our international charts today. I want to give a huge shout out to our friends who are listening in France. They actually make up almost a fifth of our downloads, Brad. They're sitting pretty at 17% of our downloads. I read a statistic that said that in terms of volume, the French drink more whiskey than anybody else each year. So thank you so much for listening to our podcast. I am so sorry that we have not given you a shout out yet, but we are more than happy to extend Brad Explains to not just America's favorite segment, but to the favorite segment of planet Earth. So this segment is where Brad breaks down the plot of the movie that he has just seen, often for the first time. Brad, was this your first time seeing Shutter Island?
This absolutely was my first time seeing Shutter Island.
All right, cool. So, Brad, before you jump right into spoiling the plot, I do want to say this is one of those movies that has, quote unquote, a twist ending. This review is going to be spoiler filled. So if you have not seen Shutter Island, I would strongly recommend going and watching it before having the entire thing ruined for you here.
Just like our cocktails episode, this one's got a twist.
Hey-o! Brad, you are just bringing the puns today, aren't you, man?
Dude, I am on it.
So, Brad, before you dive right into spoiling the movie, though, tell us a little bit about your background with it. How familiar with the movie were you prior to sitting down and actually watching it?
Honestly, Bob, coming into the movie, I had seen the previews, but other than that, I hadn't heard anybody really talk about it other than to say that they really liked it. I knew that Leo was going to come to the island as like a police officer of some sort, and that they were going to try to convince him that he was crazy. And so I kind of knew that going in, but I feel like I didn't get that from anybody. I feel like I just remember getting that from the previews back in 2009, 2010. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair, Brad. It seems like that's the kind of thing they give away in the trailer. So you knew enough about it to kind of get some of the themes out of it, and I guess to kind of perk your ears up that there might be some sort of a mystery to unravel here. And Brad, we are going to rely on you to unravel that mystery for us. So without further ado, can you walk our listeners through the plot of the movie Shutter Island?
The film Shutter Island opens with Leonardo DiCaprio playing a U.S. Marshal named Teddy Daniels. Ted is on his way to this island. He is feeling a little seasick. He's got a headache. And he meets his new partner, a guy named Chuck. They're going to investigate the disappearance of this woman on the island who had been committed for killing her 3 children. The island is a penitentiary of sorts. It is a mental hospital for the criminally, psychologically damaged that are just, trying to live out the rest of their days. And these psychologists are trying to help them out. And so Teddy gets onto the island and he begins investigating the disappearance of this woman. He's denied requests for certain things like patient files and things like that. And the doctor that was taking care of her went on vacation the morning of. You get the sense that there's a lot of issues here on the island. There's a dark, ominous soundtrack being played throughout the entire film that's really, really beautiful. And you slowly see that Teddy is being fed different sorts of drugs in his cigarettes, in his food, in the coffee, and that they're trying to force him to stay on the island. Eventually, he travels to Ward C, which is pretty much a prison cell where they keep the most dangerous of the patients. And he is told that this is a huge game that was done just for Teddy to get to him, to take him in, because he's been investigating this island for some time. Eventually, his partner seemingly dies, but he can't find the body. He is told by this doctor who was turned into a patient who then escaped that they have been using the lighthouse to do lobotomies and to turn them into these ghost patients that can go out and do terrible things, that they're trying to learn how to do mind control, just like the Nazis were doing. Teddy, throughout his time on the island, has these nightmares where he flashes back to his time liberating the Dachau concentration camp. And you see that he has lots of trauma in his life. And throughout the film, you explore this trauma where he interacts with different psychiatrists. But by the end of the film, he has all sorts of hallucinations. He tries to go back to save his partner, Chuck. He goes to the lighthouse and he finds out that the entire thing has been set up for him, that he's been living on this island for 24 months, and that he has assaulted so many orderlies and other patients that they were going to give him a lobotomy. and that the doctor convinced the board of directors to hold off to let him play out his fantasy as deep as he could go so that he would realize that they were just that, fantasies. That what actually happened was that his wife was a paranoid schizophrenic who had delusions, and that she had actually killed their 3 children by drowning them in the lake, and that in his grief over the loss of his children and the loss of the mind of his wife, he shot and killed his wife to set her free. He then had a break from reality where he could no longer consider himself that man, and so he created a new identity for himself of this U.S. Marshal that was investigating the island, and that here he is now finally having a moment of sanity. During that moment of clarity, a la Awakenings, he is told that he has had a moment of clarity like this before, but that he regressed very quickly. We then move to the final scene where he is sitting with his psychiatrist, Dr. Sheehan, who had been pretending to be his partner named Chuck. And Teddy once again says that he believes in the fantasy. He calls Dr. Sheehan Chuck. Chuck shakes his head to the main doctor, and they take him away to get a lobotomy. And that's about that.
Yeah, Brad, first of all, I want to say thank you for even attempting to explain this movie just verbally, because this is an incredibly complicated movie to try to explain. On the one hand, you have this kind of bait and switch mystery that's being built up, where DiCaprio's character says he's investigating a missing person, comes to believe that he is actually part of a conspiracy, that this island is doing incredibly sinister things to its patients. And then at the same time, he's also being haunted by these incredibly traumatic dreams and hallucinations from his own past. And then you have the big twist at the end to reveal that literally everything up to that point has been constructed as a lie that DiCaprio's character, has concocted for himself in his mind to push down the trauma and to refuse to accept the truth that he killed his wife, that his wife killed their children, that he feels partially responsible for the deaths of all 4 of his family members. And that, it's really about the lengths that the human mind will go, to not accept responsibility for things like that. It's a really sad movie. It's a really complex narrative to try to get around. And so first of all, Brad, I just want to say nicely done. I know you probably feel like you were all over the place, but that's kind of where this movie goes. And if you're not watching the movie, it's hard to follow, in terms of saying all of it out loud.
Yeah, as I got into it, I'm just like, man, I don't know. Just watch the movie yourself. There's way too much that goes on in this film. Just to recap it, I do want to kind of hit on the one thing you said about the brain. I feel like this movie is an exploration of the psychological aspect of how, like, when the body goes through extreme amounts of pain, your brain will sometimes realize that pain is no longer helpful, and it just shuts off your pain sensors. Like, have you ever heard the story about a guy who had been run over by a train and literally cut in half, and he just didn't feel it anymore after that brief instant of just crazy huge pain.
Yeah.
Like his brain just shuts it off, and I think that's what you're seeing in this movie. That his real name, Andrew Laeddis, has just shut off the part of himself that feels that pain. And it would much rather believe in a conspiracy than it would in reality.
Well, and Brad, that's, if there's one thing I could add to your synopsis, it's that very closing scene where, as the audience, you've been presented with, what may or may not be the truth, right? I mean, I think Scorsese still does a really good job of leaving it just slightly ambiguous enough that if you want to believe Teddy's conspiracy theory, you can. However, I mean, I honestly think that what was being presented to him at the end was the truth, that he was, he had gone insane as a result of what happened in his traumatic life. But the closing lines of the movie, where he's sitting on those steps talking to Mark Ruffalo's character, and he says,
this place makes me wonder.
Yeah, what's that, boss?
Which would be worse? To live as a monster? Or to die as a good man?
Teddy?
And there's this slight hint where there's different ways to interpret it. Again, that's one of the things I love about the end of the film. There's different ways to interpret it. But it's like, you could interpret it as, all right, well, the therapy just didn't stick, and he's already regressed back into thinking that he is this guy, Teddy Daniels, when he's really Andrew Laeddis. There's also the possibility that he's never been convinced of this, and he just feels so beaten down and knows that he can't escape the island that he's just going along with it. Or the third option is he knows who he is, he knows what he did, and he just cannot allow himself to accept that, to continue living on as, quote unquote, a monster. And so he's going to go along with this act just for another couple minutes so that he can go get his lobotomy and, in his own mind, die as a good man. It's a really interesting kind of ethical dilemma that you're left with at the end of the movie. And I love that they frame that question around this whole psychological thriller mystery genre.
Well, Bob, if you believe the first two options, then you're just dumb, because the third option is clearly what's happening in the movie. Because Dr. Sheehan calls out to him by his fake name, Teddy, and he doesn't even respond. He just moves on. He doesn't answer him. And the second time I watch this movie, I'm going to watch very closely to see if Teddy responds every time he is called by name.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because, I think to me it's pretty obvious that between the quote about better to die as a hero than to live as a monster and the fact that he calls his name, he knows what he's doing, bro.
Yeah. Again, and that's the interpretation that I come away with. But Brad, I want to kind of key in on one thing you just mentioned, which is talking about the second time you watch this movie. And we only have a few minutes left here before we have to get to our break, Brad. And so I think it's a good time to have this conversation now. I want to talk about this movie's rewatch value because, I saw this movie when it came out in theaters, and I feel like this is one of those movies where when you execute a twist ending really well, you leave the audience with that sort of sucker punch of an ending that it makes everything make sense. You feel satisfied as a viewer. You walk out, thinking like, holy crap, but what a movie. And this movie did that for me. And then on second viewing, I remember buying this movie when it came out on DVD. The second viewing, you go back and you watch the whole movie through again, and you're like, oh, I see all the hints now. I see how Scorsese was casting doubt the whole movie that Teddy was really he might have been an insane person the whole time. There's really cool tricks that he does, like in one scene where they're interrogating some of the patients, and one of the patients asks for a glass of water. She lifts the glass to her mouth, and there's actually nothing there in her hand the whole time. And as the audience,
I saw that.
Yeah. So there's little things that are being sown throughout the movie. But I will say this, Brad, and we're gonna be in interesting places on this, because this is probably my fifth time watching this through. I love this movie, but once you get past the initial watch, which is it works 100% on you. The second watch, which is what's coming, and you're watching it to see how masterfully they set it up. The third, fourth, fifth watch is where you kind of start to poke holes in it a little bit. I don't know how to say this, Brad. I really like this movie. I don't think it's a perfect movie. And I actually think that once you know the twist, and once you can appreciate how Scorsese disguises the twist and kind of leaves a trail of breadcrumbs, all that's left to do on rewatch is to kind of poke holes in it, which kind of sucks, because I don't want to poke holes in this. I don't want to nitpick it. But this is one of those films where the twist, I don't know how justified it is. We've talked about The Sixth Sense and how great the twist in that movie was. This one feels slightly different than The Sixth Sense, because especially when you go back and rewatch it again, what you find out is that the entire movie to this point, the entire narrative that's been constructed, is a lie. And it almost feels a little cheap and manipulative on the third, fourth, fifth viewing, because you've watched basically 2 hours of film that don't end up mattering at all to the overall outcome of the movie. And I guess I'm just kind of interested to hear from you, only having seen it once. Do you think this movie would hold up on rewatch, or do you think that, you can already start to identify places where it might fall apart a little bit for you?
Well, honestly, Bob, there wasn't really ever a twist for me. Like, I've seen enough psychological thrillers like this to know that he actually was crazy the entire time.
Oh, so you saw it coming.
Oh, 100%. I
Interesting.
thought it was the most obvious thing in
Okay,
in the
okay.
world.
Well, that's good
And,
because again, like being on the side of it that I am now, like I know it the whole time. And on this watch through, I actually found myself kind of bored at parts because I was like, I think parts of this movie will only be entertaining to people who are watching it for the first time. And that when you know the twist, it's like, oh my gosh, like get on with it.
Yeah, so I knew that the movie was going to move towards the fact that he had actually been living on the island for a long time.
That he was a patient.
That he was a patient.
Okay.
And like, they kind of set it up like, oh yeah, eventually they're going to make you seem like you're a patient. So like the movie kind of tells you that. But I kind of just had this, I just knew, I was like, yeah, there's no way that he hasn't already been a patient here the whole time. And like, he's either escaped or somehow he's like acting out his delusion. That was like my thought pretty early in the movie. But with that, I realized that this entire movie is like zooming in on A Beautiful Mind, like just on the hallucinatory part of that movie. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like when you look at A Beautiful Mind, the movie is about the story of a man's life, the entirety of John Nash's life. But a portion of his life is fake and like untrue. Shutter Island is essentially about that untrue part if you took that and turned it into the entire movie.
Everything about this place stinks of government ops. What if they wanted you here? Bullshit. You were asking questions. Bullshit. Bullshit. We came here for Rachel Solano. Where's one shred of evidence she even existed?
There's no way they could have known I'd be assigned to this case. There's no way.
Well, you were looking into them, they were looking into you. All they had to do was fake an escape to get you here, and now they have you. Now they have us both. Here, now.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so that's why I'm kind of in this weird spot with the movie, because I enjoy the hell out of this movie. And like, I really, really like it. And I think for what it does and what it's trying to do, it works. Because like, at its most basic level, this is Scorsese basically making what we would call a B movie. You know, this is like the sort of cheap exploitative horror movies of his youth that he came up with, that he's like recreating in a more artful way. You know what I mean? Like this movie was never intended to be his Academy Award winning film. It's kind of a fun diversion for him. And I do think that, you know, the source material, this is based on a book by Dennis Lehane, like it throws in some nice little wrinkles about ethics and things like that. But yeah, Brad, at its core, it kind of is a cheap, exploitative, pulpy kind of story. And you also mentioned another movie that is kind of, you know, tangentially related to this, which is Awakenings, which we watched at the end of last season. This movie has a really interesting premise, which would be like, what if you told the story of Awakenings from inside the mind of Robert De Niro's character when he has his brief window of awakening? And the only understanding of the world and the only sense of reality that you as a viewer experience is through the eyes of this person who is just coming back to life. That's essentially what's happening here. Like, you have a mentally unstable person who is concocting this crazy story and narrative around him. And the question becomes for you, the viewer, like, how far are you willing to go with him in believing that kind of conspiracy to be true? It's a fun movie. It's a fun exercise, you know, in kind of bait and switch storytelling. But again, like, you know, you were talking about A Beautiful Mind. This is not that. This is not interested in sort of like the larger worldview. It's putting you in the shoes of an unreliable narrator.
Right. And I think one of the interesting things for me is that the reason I love A Beautiful Mind isn't because of his breaks from reality. It's because he has an interesting life story that I care about. And so the reason I go back and watch that movie again is because I care about the character of John Nash. Whereas with Shutter Island, I don't know if I would come back to the movie because in the end, you don't really get Leo's story, you know, his character's story until the very end of the film. And at that point, it's such a dark, terrifying, and disturbing story that I don't know if I really want to care about that character again. And so I don't have a character that I really care about in this movie the way I do with other movies about mental breaks from reality. And so Shutter Island then is interesting because of the suspense, the terror, the whodunit of it all.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Brad. You have to distinguish in terms of like categories. And I feel like when we talk about it like this, we run the risk of sounding kind of snooty or snobbish because we're like, well, this isn't a film, it's a movie. You know what I mean? It's like, it's a movie. It's there for the entertainment value. And I don't mean it like that. I think you really can still enjoy this movie a lot, which I think we both did.
Yeah.
But
well, Bob, I'm not going to lie. I'm prepping to have a baby here in a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started this movie and I was building a nightstand that's going to go next to the crib. And so I'm sitting on the floor, I'm watching the movie, I'm, putting in screws and stuff. And I get about halfway into the movie and Haley had woken up from sleeping for work tonight. And she called my name about 4 or 5 times and came out. And I was just sitting in the middle of all of this, like prefabbed wooden pieces, just like staring at the television with a unmoving screwdriver in my hand. And I was not answering her because I was so engrossed in this film. I was just utterly taken by it. I had stopped like a quarter of the way through trying to build this stupid thing. And I was just totally taken by this movie.
Yeah. And I think we could go on and on talking about the filmmaking quality here, because this is where, a filmmaker like Scorsese can take this material, which is at best, like, I guess we would call it like a pulpy kind of story, and really elevate it to truly being an artistic achievement.
Well, I think it's a little bit unfair to call it pulpy because, like, Pulp Fiction, and not the movie Pulp Fiction, but like actual Pulp Fiction, I think about like kind of dirty, gross, like guilty pleasure type of things. Mm-hmm. And I guess when I look at this, I do think that you can see the work of a master in the making of this movie.
For sure.
And but just because the characters themselves aren't like the most likable or rewatchable doesn't mean that it's I don't know. I guess I'm just grading a little bit against the term pulpy. I like this movie. Maybe I'm just being selfish. I liked this movie way too much for you to call it pulpy, Bob.
I liked it a lot too, Brad, and I'm excited to see where our scores end up on this. We have lots more to talk about. I do want to talk about the filmmaking. I do want to talk about the performances in this. But before we get there, Brad, let's hit pause and let's try this Willett 4-year rye.
Let's get to it.
All right, so today we are checking out Willett Family Estate Bottled 4-Year Rye. Now, that is a mouthful to say. The Willett Company is very widely known for their whiskey, and it's kind of a premier brand. Some of you might know Willett from the Willett Pot Still Bourbon, which is a bottle that's literally shaped like a pot still. It's really, really hard to get. A lot of their whiskey is really hard to get. Willett made a name for themselves as a company by sourcing whiskey and doing a really good job at it. And now they have started releasing some of their own products. I am like being incredibly reductionistic about the history of the Willett Company. Those of you who listen to this podcast and are huge whiskey people, you likely know the story of the Willett Company. But for the purposes of keeping this brief, they are releasing their own product now. It is also really hard to come by. It can also be really expensive. One of those products is the Willett Family Estate Bottled Rye. This is a 4-year rye, and it clocks in at 55% alcohol by volume or 110 proof. So, Brad, I don't know how much you knew about the Willett Company coming into today. I don't want to color your perception of anything, except to say that we have been kind of on a streak here of highly allocated, hard to find whiskeys, and that the Willett Company falls right in with that. This is a hard to find rye, even at being only 4 years old and 110 proof. We're in the same kind of air that we have been in with some of the Buffalo Trace products we've been trying for the last few weeks.
Which I still will say, what the heck, man? It's ridiculous. However, I get to this Willett, and man, it's got some nice stuff going on here, Bob. I think it's a really interesting whiskey. I am growing in my appreciation for ryes. I think that, man, ryes just have so much variability and options, and I'm really excited about this, Bob.
Well, good, Brad. And again, I don't want to waste all of our time in this review segment talking about, the prices that it's set at or the allocation. Again, I've never seen a bottle of this on the shelf in Ohio. I would imagine that it's either, just super highly allocated or a lottery pick. I know that the price elsewhere has gone up pretty astronomically over the last few years, but I want to focus on what's in the glass here, Brad. And when I take a nosing of this, I think it's very bright. There are ryes that we sample, Brad, that really lean into the sort of darker, grainier elements that just smell like rye bread. There's some that we have that really lean into the minty aspect or the more dill side. This one has a lot of really nice bright oak notes on it. You get a lot of the rye. You can tell from the nose, this is a rye whiskey. But I don't think that it has like an offensively grainy nose to it. I also don't think it leans too far into either the mint or the sort of sour dill pickle kind of thing we get sometimes. It's just a really nice, wood-forward, light-smelling, bright rye whiskey.
I'm pretty close to you there, Bob. For me, I'm getting some fruity notes on there, almost like a green apple, even a little bit of the darker stuff, like a plum note. I think that there's some really interesting, fresh notes going on here that I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10. I think it's missing a little bit of mustard to it, and not like the actual flavor, but I feel like it has some potency that could come through on 110 proof that I'm not getting here. But overall, this is an impressive nose.
Yeah, I'm impressed by the fact that it's not super alcohol forward. This is about 75% rye. I think technically it's 74.5% rye in the mash bill. So you do get a lot of that really great rye scent to it. But again, they've kept it very light and pleasant on the nose. I like that a lot. I'm going to give it a 7.5 on the nose. And Brad, let's give it a sip.
Ooh, that's a little more spicy than I expected. Wow, that is fun, Bob.
Oh, Brad, I like this a lot. Ooh, and then there's a second wave of alcohol burn and heat that comes after you swallow. You get the initial kind of hug, and then it shot back up my mouth again with a little extra electric charge. Oh, I like this a lot, Brad. I think it's not very thick, it's not super viscous. It's very, very sweet on the front end, a vague kind of honey sweetness to me. You get the rye spice in the mid and the back of the palate. When you go to swallow, it's pretty well matured rye grain and oak. And then you get a really nice Kentucky hug, and the alcohol makes itself known, on the very end of the taste going into the finish. I think this is just a really solid kind of box ticker. Everything that you'd want in a really well done rye is present here. I don't think anything stands out like a 10 out of 10, but it's just solid all the way through.
Yeah, I think it's well deserving of an 8 out of 10 on the palate. You're getting some of those floral notes mixed with a bit of a surprise of those spicy rye cinnamony notes that really just linger for a while. I am impressed with this whiskey.
It's got a bit of dustiness to it as well. There's that distinct, not funky note, but when you and I drink old, dusty bottles, Brad, and you get that sort of the smell of old books and leather, and there's a distinct sort of old whiskey taste. This has a little bit of that at only 4 years. So I really, really enjoy that. It tastes like the kind of whiskey that you've pulled down off the shelf and said, hey, this was actually bottled, 40 years ago.
For Ron Burgundy.
Exactly. It tastes like an old wooden ship. Brad, I'm going to give it an 8.5 on the taste. I like this a lot.
Yeah, it's really impressive. And when I get to the finish, It's not an incredibly strong burn on the back end, which I think is really, really great. You know, a lot of these higher proof content whiskeys can just burn the heck out of your throat. And this one does not do that. It leaves you with a few floral notes to complement what's been happening on the palate. There's a nice little burn. It's a really impressive finish. I'm going to stick it my 8 out of 10.
Yeah, I think the finish for me is not a very long-lasting finish. It fades nicely, though. It's not like an immediate drop-off, and it doesn't linger so long that it gets kind of annoying to you. The rye and the oak are what predominantly stay on the palate. The Kentucky Hug is not super harsh, like Brad was saying. 110 proof is, I feel like, a really nice proof point for this to be at, because it's not high proof enough to burn too much, but it definitely makes itself known on the way down. I'm going to go ahead and give it an 8 out of 10. Could it be a little bit longer lasting? Probably, but what you get is very, very enjoyable.
And when we get to balance, Bob, I look at this whiskey, I can't think of many things wrong with it in the balance category. Like you said, it really checks all the boxes that you're looking for in a rye. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 on balance.
Yeah, Brad, I think I'm like right there with you. I don't think that this is knocking my socks off in any particular area in terms of, you know, the sweetness or the spice or the alcohol delivery. For me, I hate using the word solid. I feel like it's very overused, but I think that's kind of what I would say here, that nothing about this is bad. I would even say nothing about this is below average. But everything is kind of hitting at like an 8 out of 10 level for me. So is it, I guess, like when I get to balance, the question becomes, is it a 10 out of 10 on balance because they did such a great job of keeping everything consistent? Or is it an 8 out of 10 because I feel like that's where everything is kind of hitting for me? So you know what? I'll split the difference here. I'll give it an 8.5 on balance. I think this is a phenomenally balanced whiskey. It's just not, it doesn't have like the highest high peaks for me, if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. It doesn't jump into that epic or legendary category, but man, it sits in that just like, it's firmly in the great, this is just a really, really good whiskey.
When it comes to value, it's kind of all over the place. I'm looking at different websites right now trying to price this out. On Caskers, it's $85. I'm seeing some independent retailers that are selling it for between $70 and $80. The lowest I've seen is like $65. So I think that a good price point for us to set, let's just call it $75. Because especially if you can't find it on the shelf somewhere, you're going to have to get it from an online retailer. And I would say you're looking at probably $75, plus maybe shipping. So, Brad, as a high-end, limited availability product, how do we want to rate this? Do we think that this is a $75 rye just because that's what they're setting the price at? Does it drink like a $75 rye should? How would you evaluate this in terms of value?
I think for me, $70, $80 is a little bit on the high side for this. Mm-hmm. Not by like a terrible amount. Like I think this is a $50 to $60 whiskey that is just hard to get. And so it's $70 or $80. So I'm going to give it a 6.5 out of 10 on value. I think it's really good. I think if you can get your hands on a bottle of this with a few friends, get it. If it's at your local whiskey bar, get it. It is a spectacular whiskey that maybe it's a little price too big for its britches, but yeah, I'll forgive it. It's a good whiskey, Bob.
Yeah, Brad, I think I'll give it a 5 out of 10 on value. I do think it's overpriced. I don't think it's exorbitantly overpriced, though. And in fact, I'm reading some reviews of this from when it was first released, and you know, these are from a couple years ago. And at that point, it was retailing for $55. Now, again, the market has driven the price on this way up. But if this was still priced at $55, I'd probably give it like a 9 out of 10 on value. I think this really, it earns its high-end reputation. I just don't know if it earns a $75 price tag. So I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10, and that's going to put me out to a 37.5 out of 50. Brad, what's that putting you out at?
I am currently sitting at a 39 out of 50. One of the higher scored whiskeys from the season, I believe.
Yeah, definitely. We're coming out to a 76.5 out of 100 or a 38.25 out of 50. I really think that if it wasn't for the price, Brad, this definitely would have cracked that 40 mark. And in terms of just like what we think of the liquid in the glass, this would definitely be a 40 out of 50 for me. But again, we always factor in the value of what it takes for you to go to the store or to find a bottle of it on the shelf and how much it's going to hurt you in the wallet. So is it exorbitantly priced? I don't think so, but it's a little bit overpriced for my taste.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Bob. It's a great whiskey that, if it were more accessible, might break into the upper echelon of like one of our favorite whiskeys ever.
Well, Brad, I'm glad we both enjoyed this one. What do you say we carry this positivity into the back half of our episode and get back to talking about Shutter Island? All right, so that was Willett Family Estate 4-Year Rye, a whiskey that we both really, really enjoyed. And we're getting back into talking about a movie that we both enjoyed watching, Shutter Island. Now, Brad, we have spent so much time talking about, the twist of this movie that we really haven't gotten into the filmmaking itself. And I really do think that this is one of Scorsese's best movies of this new millennium. It came out in a really interesting period for him, which is that like post-Departed, pre-Irishman phase that he's been in the last 10-ish years. And, it came out right before Hugo in 2012. I don't know if you ever saw Hugo. I liked Hugo a lot, but this movie and Hugo were both kind of departures for him in terms of the stories that he likes to tell, generally speaking. And I think that this material was definitely more suited to his sensibilities. Like we've talked a lot. We just talked a few weeks ago about this in our Goodfellas rewatch about how he really loves to insert, freeze frames and do whip pans and move the camera in crazy ways. Thelma Schoonmaker and her insane editing choices where they just throw continuity to the wind and people's hands are in different places from shot to shot. I feel like that editing style that Scorsese has become known for really suits this material well because it increases, as a viewer, like your disorientation. It really throws you off. And I feel like it makes you question the reality of what's going on even that much more, than if it had been edited in a more conventional way.
Yeah, from the very beginning of the movie, you're kind of tossed about on the waves, just like Teddy is as he's, getting sick on his journey towards Shutter Island. And so whether it's the music and the way that the music kind of precipitates these terrifying revelations, or this, being drawn into the depths of insanity, or the way that the camera work is done, that you get these crazy shots of the inside of Ward C where you see all of these metal steps and grates and you're never quite sure where you're at in the ward. I think it's representative of the whole movie that the entire purpose of the movie is to make you unsure of where you are as a viewer of this movie. Do you believe Teddy throughout the movie? Do you not believe him? What's up with Chuck, his partner, who's kind of just seems like he's along for the ride? There's so many things about this film that are meant to disorient you. And I think in the hands of a lesser filmmaker, you just kind of have a C-grade crappy film. But when you have Scorsese making a movie like this, it really does become something more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, totally agree, Brad. And I feel badly because we've gone so far down the rabbit hole with this that we really have neglected to talk about what we thought about the direction, what we thought about the performances. We do need to wind down here soon, so I guess let's hit the lightning round here with the performances, Brad. In terms of DiCaprio, let's just get him out of the way quickly here. Where does this kind of rank for you in terms of DiCaprio performances? What do you think of this performance? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it just kind of solid and nothing more? How would you rate him here?
Better than Inception, but worse than Revenant.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah, I feel like this is like mid to higher tier DiCaprio. Like if you broke his movies down into thirds, this is like upper third. But it's also not one of those movies that really allows him to shine too much because it's so plot heavy. Kind of like Inception in that way. I do think that the scene where they finally reveal his past, which is just, I mean, truly disturbing and heartbreaking. Heartbreaking.
I was gonna say, we haven't gotten into this. That was like just horrible.
Yeah. Well,
like,
I think what I liked about it though was that, you know, the movie had some gothic horror elements to it, but when they finally revealed what truly happened in reality, Scorsese doesn't play up the horror elements of it. It's a really, truly heartbreaking thing to watch. And I think that underpinning this movie with the weight of emotional trauma really helped it out a lot. Because I think that in a lesser filmmaker's hands, this ending really could have been cheap and felt exploitative. You know, anything involving dead kids is like a huge red flag for me. I really struggle with stuff like with viewing stuff like that. But I really did think that the way that they executed it was incredibly well done. And you can truly see DiCaprio's grief coming through in that scene. I really do think he knocks it out of the park in what is honestly the most crucial scene of the whole movie. So I really do think he's great.
Yeah. I really like his performance a lot. But in the end, what do you think about some of the other characters? What do you think about like Ben Kingsley, Mark Ruffalo? Well, where are you at with the supporting cast?
Well, first of all, Ben Kingsley's just a great actor. I think that the brilliance of casting him is that he's played enough good guys and he's played enough bad guys that you're always on edge about, is he lying or is he telling the truth? And once the suspicion is sown about Mark Ruffalo as well, Mark Ruffalo does a fantastic job of also playing it both ways. Like once he first starts to suspect that his partner is in on it, and then when they're split up in Ward C, and then they come back together when they escape, and he's trying to give him that patient intake form, and you can start to see that DiCaprio's suspicious, Ruffalo starts playing it both ways too, where every action he takes after that, you as an audience member are like, I don't know what to think of you. And I think both of those guys really, really play that up well. I don't think Ruffalo has a ton to do in this movie, but Kingsley and him both do exactly what they need to do to make the twist of the movie work, I think.
Can you give me some other movies that Kingsley is in? Because I kind of recognize him, but I really don't know what from.
So Ben Kingsley is a really famous actor. He won an Academy Award in 1982 for the movie Gandhi, where he played Gandhi. He's been nominated for a bunch of Oscars. You might know him as Stern from Schindler's List. That was one of his more famous roles. He's one of those guys that kind of crops up every couple years. You'll see him in a movie and you'll be like, oh, there he is. There's Ben Kingsley. But I think his most famous two roles probably would be those two that I just mentioned, Gandhi and Schindler's List. He also showed up just a couple years after this in Hugo. I'm sure that you've seen a movie with him in it, Brad, but those would be his most famous roles.
Okay, yeah, I've seen Schindler's List. It's been a little while. But other than that, I don't think I've seen any movies with him in it. So I liked him in this. He was really good.
And Brad, I mean, when you look at this cast list, it really does go down quite a long way in terms of recognizable actors. And maybe some of them for you are more of a that guy than a name that you recognize. You know, Patricia Clarkson playing Rachel Solando in The Cave. Like, she's a really recognizable actress. You've got Ted Levine, the guy who played the serial killer in Silence of the Lambs, who plays the warden in this movie. It goes down quite a ways. I really think that overall, the performances in this movie are really, really great, even from somebody like Max von Sydow, who is a horror movie icon, who, Brad, you were telling me off air, you were convinced that was actually Christopher Plummer, right?
Oh, I was 100% like proud of myself. I was like, oh yeah, it's Christopher Plummer. Got it. Nailed it.
Whoops.
Moving on.
Whoopsies. But yeah, I think everybody's really, really, I mean, they're not phoning it in. The casting is very self-aware. I feel like having a lot of these horror movie people show up in this movie, you know, it's almost like a nod to the audience that we're going to try to throw you off your game a little bit here. But the performances all work really, really well. I think my only, I don't even know if I'd call it a criticism, is just that this is not a movie that's designed to be about performances. It's a movie that's designed to be about plot, and a movie that's designed to be about a twist ending. And so even though I think everyone does a really good job, this was never going to be the kind of movie that you would like nominate somebody for an Academy Award for. Does that make sense?
Well, it kind of does. I guess for me, Bob, I had the exact opposite experience. I was so deeply expecting a twist that I wasn't drawn in by that element of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just left with what's going on with the camera work and the sound and, how are the characters interacting with one another and what's the lighting like in this scene? And for me, those things were all done so daggone well that I really loved this movie. And then the twist on top of it was engaging and interesting and fun. And I probably shouldn't use the word fun because it was terrifying and depressing. But like the twist was really well done. So I was like, oh, like I was expecting the twist. It was really well done. Cool. But on top of that, you have just an incredible director giving us a really well-made movie.
Yeah.
So I don't know, man. I still really liked it a lot.
So again, I feel like this is not a black and white thing, right? I'm not saying I didn't enjoy the movie. I'm not saying I don't love this movie. And I think we can both agree that if it wasn't for having such incredible actors in the movie, and if it wasn't for having Scorsese behind the camera, on its own, I feel like this movie would have only been like a 5 out of 10. But having these people around it, supporting it, really elevated the material. And I think we could probably both agree on that, right?
Oh, 100%.
Well, Brad, I think that that's a great segue into our final scores then. And I want to hear yours first because you've just watched it for the first time. And I think the movie is still at like maximum effectiveness for you. So where are you coming out on this one, Brad?
I think I'm going to sit at an 8 out of 10.
Oh, interesting.
It's a really great, entertaining, fun movie that I would probably watch 1 or 2 more times, especially if it was with somebody who hadn't seen it before. But I can tell that it's limited in its scope, and I think Scorsese probably meant it to be that way.
Sure.
I think that it's okay to say that this isn't necessarily a movie that was made to be watched 97 times.
Right.
I think it was made to be watched a few times in your lifetime and just enjoy it for what it is. And yeah, 8 out of 10.
So if you'd asked me before this last watch through, I probably would have given this movie a 9 because I do feel like it's kind of slept on. And if you go through and read like critics' reactions when it first came out, I think Scorsese has set the bar so high for himself that when he makes a movie like this is when you really start to see critics get their snooty, dismissive side on. And a lot of critics did dismiss this movie as a misstep for Scorsese, which I don't think it is. I think it is an incredible exercise in him making a genre movie, like him stepping out of what he normally does with crime films and doing something completely different and just showing the world what a master filmmaker he really is. And for that alone, I think this movie is worth watching. But on top of that, it is emotionally affecting. Even if I do think the twist is a little bit manipulative, and even if I do think that repeat viewings of this movie definitely take away something from it, I still think that it's probably better than, 90% of the psychological thrillers that are coming out, year after year.
It's better than Goodfellas at the very least.
Okay, well, first of all, absolutely not. But I am going to give this movie an 8.5 out of 10, which brings our final score to an 8.25. Brad, I think that's actually a really good place for this to sit. It's a really well done movie, and I think it deserves more recognition than it gets, but it's still probably not in that upper echelon of Scorsese movies or films in general.
But in the end, we want to know what you have to say about this. Is Shutter Island your favorite Scorsese film, or do you just think it's a piece of pulp, terrible genre crappiness? Let us know on our Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter at Film Whiskey.
I like that you took all the words that I used in my positive review of it for your negative characterization.
My goal is ultimately
I gave it a higher score than you did, Brad.
My goal is to subvert Film and Whiskey Nation against you,
I was
Bob.
going to say, all right, well, whatever. If you would also like to call out Brad for the way he's trying to gaslight you all into hating me, you can also give us a phone call. Our number is 216-800-5923. Once again, that number is 216-800-5923. You can also leave a voicemail message for us on our webpage at anchor.fm/filmwhiskey.
Next week, we will be looking at 2010's The Social Network. For the Film and Whiskey podcast, I'm Brad G.
I'm Bob Book.
And we did it backwards. What's the Hulk's name again? It's Chuck.
The Hulk.
The second,
right,
the second Hulk.
Right. the third Hulk? Eric Bana, and then
I mean,
Edward Norton.
I guess really
and
the
then-
fourth Hulk, if you want to
Oh, that's
include
true.
the
Lou Ferrigno.
Lou Ferrigno.
I want the Shutter Island with Lou Ferrigno as his partner.
I want Lou Ferrigno to be the psychiatrist.
I want him to be Rachel Solando. just in a cave with a dress on. Hey, how'd you get in here?